Robert Duvall found out that a production company had used his neighbor's land without permission and driven equipment through 2 acres of winter wheat in the process. The neighbor hadn't complained. The production company hadn't offered anything. Duvall handled it himself, in a way that cost him money he hadn't planned to spend, and produced a result that the neighbor has described the same way every time he's told the story since. The production was a mid-budget thriller shooting exteriors in Rappahannock County, Virginia, in November 2004. The location department had scouted the area in September and had obtained permits for 2 properties on Route 622, a barn and an adjacent field that provided the visual backdrop the director wanted for a chase sequence. What the location department had not obtained, through an error that was either administrative or deliberate, and that the production company's subsequent behavior did little to clarify, was permission to use the access road that ran between the permitted properties and the farm belonging to a man named Roy Elkins. Roy Elkins was 71 years old, had farmed his land in Rappahannock County for 40 years, and had the specific, unhurried relationship with that land that comes from being the 3rd generation to work it. His grandfather had cleared the south field in 1931. His father had put in the drainage that made it viable for winter crops. Roy had maintained both of these things and added a 3rd, the access road that ran along the south edge, which he had graded and graveled at his own expense in 1987 to make the farm easier to work. The access road that the production trucks had used, the access road that ran when trucks went off its surface directly into the winter wheat, and had planted winter wheat on the south field in October, a standard November crop for that part of Virginia, seeded carefully and expected to establish over the winter for a spring harvest. The access road that the production's equipment trucks used on a Tuesday morning ran directly through the edge of that south field. 2 of the trucks, a grip truck and a generator truck, had gone off the road surface onto the field itself to make room for a passing vehicle. The damage covered approximately 2 acres. Roy Elkins had seen it from his kitchen window at 7 in the morning. He had watched the trucks move through his field without stopping, without anyone getting out to look at what they had done, without any acknowledgement from the production that something had gone wrong. He had stood at his kitchen window for a while and then gone back to his coffee, because Roy Elkins was not a man who made quick decisions about how to respond to things, and because at 71 he had learned that most situations benefited from a period of consideration before action. He had not called anyone. He had not complained to the production. He had not called the county. He had stood at his kitchen window, watched his winter wheat get driven over, and gone back to his coffee. Robert Duvall found out about it on Wednesday. He had not been involved in the production and had no connection to it. It had come to Rappahannock County through the county's film office, which handled these permits, and Duvall had been aware in a general way that there was a production in the area, the same way he was aware of most things that happened in the county. Peripherally, from the accumulated background information of someone who has lived somewhere long enough to absorb its patterns without trying to. He found out the way things circulate in small rural counties through the specific network of people who know each other at the hardware store and the feed supply and the post office, and who pass information between them in the unhurried, thorough way of communities where everyone's business is eventually connected to everyone else's. A neighbor of Roy's had mentioned it at the feed supply. The feed supply owner had mentioned it to someone whose farm was adjacent to Duvall's. That person had mentioned it to Duvall's farm manager, Luis Reyes, who had mentioned it to Duvall at the end of the workday. Duvall asked 2 questions. How bad was the damage, and had anyone from the production been in touch with Roy? The answers were 2 acres, and no. He drove to Roy Elkins's farm on Thursday morning. Roy was in the equipment barn when Duvall pulled in, working on a piece of machinery with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who has been maintaining his own equipment for 40 years and does it the way he does everything, thoroughly and without drama. He looked up when Duvall came in, without particular surprise, in the way of a man who has few visitors and receives the ones he has with equal composure, regardless of who they are. They had been neighbors for more than a decade, their properties separated by a half-mile of mixed timber and pasture that made each farm its own distinct world, while keeping them close enough that the sound of equipment carried between them on still mornings. Duvall had bought his property in the early 90s. Roy had been there since he took over from his father in 1979. They had the relationship of men who respect each other's work without needing to discuss it, who understand, from watching each other's farms across the years, something essential about the other person's character without ever having sat down to discover it directly. They were not close friends. They were the kind of neighbors that rural properties produce, where the distance between houses is large enough that proximity is a choice rather than an inevitability, and where the relationship is cordial and respectful and based more on the shared understanding of the land than on any particular personal history. Roy knew who Duval was. Duval knew who Roy was. They had talked at the feed supply, at the post office, at the occasional community event. They had lent each other equipment twice. "I heard about the field," Duval said. Roy looked at him. "Word travels," he said. "Has anyone from the production been in touch?" Roy picked up a wrench. "No," he said. "Are you going to contact them?" Roy considered this with the same unhurried deliberation he brought to most things. "I haven't decided," he said. Duval looked at him for a moment. "What's the loss?" he asked. Roy set down the wrench. He had done the calculation the previous evening at his kitchen table, with the same care he applied to his annual accounts. He told Duval the number, the value of the seed, the projected yield on the 2 acres, the cost of replanting if the weather window remained open, and the additional labor. It was not a catastrophic number. It was, for a man running a farm on margins that required everything to go roughly as planned, a significant one. Duval nodded. "I'll take care of it," he said. Roy looked at him. "This isn't your problem," Roy said. "It happened on land next to mine," Duval said, "by a production that was working in this county partly because this county agreed to have them. That makes it adjacent to my problem, which is close enough." Roy Elkins looked at him with the expression of a man assessing an argument he has just heard for the first time and finding it more solid than he had expected. "I'm not asking for money," Roy said. "I know you're not," Duval said. "I'm not offering it because you asked." He drove to the production office that afternoon with the straightforward intention of a man who has identified a thing that needs doing and is going to do it. He had not called ahead. He had not consulted anyone. He had told Luis Reyes he would be back before dinner and driven the 12 miles to the production base camp on Route 522 with the windows down and the October afternoon around him and nothing in particular on his mind except the conversation he was about to have. The production was still in the county. They had 2 more shooting days scheduled on properties on the other side of the county from Roy's farm, which meant the trucks and the equipment and the 100 and some people who made up the working unit were still present and contactable and had not yet left the jurisdiction, which mattered for the kind of conversation Duval was about to have. The location manager was a man in his 30s named Greg Walsh, who was reached at the production's base camp on a pull-off on Route 522 and who looked, when Duval introduced himself and explained why he was there, like a man receiving a situation he was not entirely certain he had the authority to handle. "I understand there was an access issue on Route 622, Duval said. Greg Walsh confirmed that there had been a routing issue, yes, and that the department had been made aware of it and was reviewing the permit documentation. "Roy Elkins' south field took about 2 acres of damage," Duval said. "Winter wheat. I'd like you to settle it with him directly, and I'd like it done before you wrap in this county." Greg Walsh said he would need to escalate it to the production manager. He said this in the voice of a man who is buying time while he works out who is going to be unhappy about this conversation and how unhappy they are going to be. "Escalate it," Duval said. "Today." He said it in the same plain, unhurried voice he used for most things, which somehow communicated more urgency than volume would have. He left his phone number and drove back to his farm. He made himself dinner, did what the evening required, and went to bed without knowing yet how the situation would resolve, which was fine, because he had done what he could do that day, and the rest was someone else's part to play. The production manager, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been doing this job for 15 years and who had a significantly more direct relationship with accountability than her location manager, called Duval that evening. She said the production was prepared to make Roy Elkins whole for the documented damage. She said she was sorry it hadn't been handled sooner. She said it in the voice of someone who means it rather than someone performing it, which Duval noted and appreciated. "He'll expect to hear from someone directly," Duval said. "Not through a lawyer and not through a check in the mail. Someone should go to the farm. Sandra Okafor said she would go herself, which was not the kind of thing production managers typically did for agricultural damage disputes in rural counties, and which was the reason, Duval thought, that the conversation had gone the way it did. She was a person who understood what it meant to say she would do something. She did. Sandra Okafor was at Roy Elkins's farm on Friday morning, sat at his kitchen table, looked at his numbers, and wrote him a check for the full amount plus the labor costs. She also, on her own initiative, arranged for a local agricultural supply company to deliver replacement seed at the production's expense before the planting window closed. Roy Elkins accepted all of it with the composed dignity of a man who had not expected to be dealt with fairly, and who was adjusting his expectations accordingly. He thanked Sandra Okafor in the brief, direct way he thanked people when he meant it, and did not want to make more of it than was necessary. She thanked him for his patience, which was the honest thing to say, and he accepted this also without commentary. He called Duval on Friday afternoon. "They came," he said. "Good," Duval said. "You didn't have to do any of that," Roy said. Duval was quiet for a moment. "The production was in this county because people here agreed to have them," he said. "When they leave, this county should be the same as when they arrived. That's just what's owed." He paused for a moment. Roy didn't make it anyone's problem. That doesn't mean it wasn't one. The replacement seed arrived from the agricultural supply company on Saturday morning, 2 days before the planting window was projected to close. Roy Elkins planted it himself that afternoon, in the same careful, systematic way he planted everything, row by row, with the attention of a man who understands that what you put in the ground in November determines what you harvest in spring, and that the quality of the attention at the beginning of the process cannot be compensated for by any amount of effort at the end. The South Field produced a full spring harvest the following year. Roy Elkins has farmed his land in Rappahannock County for 40 years. The South Field produced a spring harvest the following year. He has told the story of the Tuesday morning and the Thursday visit and the Friday settlement to a handful of people over the years. His son, a neighbor, the man at the feed supply who had started the chain of information that reached Duval in the first place. He tells it the same way every time, in the plain, factual manner of a man who does not embellish what has happened, because what happened is sufficient on its own. He starts with the Tuesday morning and the kitchen window. He ends with the Friday settlement. He does not describe his own feelings about any of it, because he considers his feelings about it secondary to the facts of it, and because the facts speak more clearly than his feelings do. He tells it the same way every time. "He found out on Wednesday," he says. "He was at my barn on Thursday. He had it handled by Friday. I never asked him for anything. He just thought something was owed and went and got it." He pauses. That's the whole story. That's the kind of neighbor he is. Roy Elkins turned 78 this past spring. He still farms the same land. The South Field is in good shape. He mentioned to the man at the feed supply who had started the whole chain of information 20 years ago that it had been a good year for winter wheat. The man at the feed supply said he was glad to hear it. If this story reminded you that the people who live next to us deserve the same standard of fairness as the people we have formal obligations to, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit the notification bell. More stories about what it really means to be Robert Duvall are coming every single week.